Okay, today we are looking at this essay question. It's on the poor law, but don't make a mistake. Don't focus any of your essay on what the new Amendment Act of 1834 does and its subsequent reactions. You want to focus for this question on these years, okay? There's a reason why they put those years in the question. And it's all about understanding what the old poor law system was like before the Amendment Act. So the Elizabethan Poor Law obviously starts under Queen Elizabeth, hence the name, in 1601. And it will more or less be received positively for the next 200 years. The way it was administered is that each parish had to implement it, and they didn't have to do it in any specific way. They had to just provide some kind of help to the poor, and each parish decided on how they would do that. Now, parish is just one of the forms of how government was divided in local government, and it comes from the church hierarchy, that term, parish. And there's about 15,000 of them in the country. And each one would decide on the system themselves. Now, the main form of help that the parishes would do for the very poor was outdoor relief. That's just referring to providing some kind of help so they didn't have to go inside to do some kind of work. Okay, that's why it's very simply called outdoor relief. People would be given either a dole of money, some form of benefit, and they could just use that money to help them out when they've got temporary unemployment, similar to unemployment benefit today. Versus the very aged, the infirm, the sick could be looked after in specific houses for them or hospitals, and then things like the poorhouses, where they could get some looking after. These poorhouses would later be converted to more rigorous work type homes, and then later be known as workhouses. And orphans would be looked after in orphanages. Now, as each parish could do what they wanted, oftentimes the help that was given wasn't very effective. But on the whole, the advantage of letting the parishes help the poor is that they knew everyone else. Remember, this is a time when the population is very small, so most people are living in villages or small towns, and they know each other. So you know that if someone has gone out of work, you know the reasons why, you know that it has happened, you know that they're not lying, and you want to help them out. Okay, you might have grown up with them, you know the faces around. So that is the big advantage of how parishes would help out the poor in this way. So here, it just reviews what we've covered, how the parish system helped the able-bodied or those unable to help themselves by being provided with outdoor relief. Who actually administered this was an overseer of the poor. That was the term that they had. And the poor were generally known as paupers. How this was all paid. In each parish, anyone who owned their own property had to pay a special tax for this purpose called the poor rate. Now, one of the inefficiencies with the fact that it's not a uniform system, that each parish does their own thing, is that towards the 19th century, by 1800, not only is population getting bigger, but more and more people are starting to move around. Throughout most of history, people just stayed where they were born, and that's where they would grow up and where they would get their jobs. Not many people would travel around the country and settle elsewhere. But it's happening more and more frequently. And it becomes an annoyance that if a poor person, wished to move to another parish, then they had to get this certificate of settlement, because the parish that they're born into has to be the one that helps them out, that pays for the outdoor relief that they're going to get, even if they're not actually living in that parish anymore. But it works up until the 1800s, because it's not many people that will do this, and it doesn't affect that many parishes. So now I'm going to go through a couple of the ways that the parishes would help. These are the most common ones, the first being the roundsman system. Here, the overseer who ran the relief would give able people a ticket. They would use this ticket that was signed off by the parish to a local farmer that might need some work. The farmer would then be able to pay very, very low rates for this help, and the poor person would work all day and receive the same amount of money as they would from the poor relief. So instead of being given a handout of money, a dole, from the parish, they would get the money, but for doing a certain type of work. Okay, and the most common one was on the farms. Now this was great for the farmers, because they could get some much needed labor, some much needed extra help, and they could pay a lot less than they would full-time workers that they would have to hire. So this is great for them. And it's good for the parish, because they're able to lower the cost slightly for themselves, and how they the amount of money that they pay. The other most common way of helping out the poor was the Speen-Hamlin system. Now this one really starts being used widely during the French Revolution. This is a time when Britain is very worried about a revolution happening at home. They're worried about some of the ideas of the revolution spreading among the very poor, very working class. So those at the top, those in power, are wanting to give some kind of help, some kind of reform, to make sure that people don't turn towards revolution. And they decide that actually, as long as people have enough food, as long as they're not going hungry, they won't be tempted to have revolution. That was one of the major causes of the revolution in France, was the fact that they couldn't afford their bread. So this is trying to address that issue. You would get money, but this system ties the amount of money you get to the price of bread. So the higher the price of bread, the larger payment that you'd get. So specifically, the amount of money you'd get would be 3 times the cost of one loaf of bread. So if a single gallon loaf of bread, let's write that down, cost 1 shilling, then the amount for one person that they'd get in the relief would be 3 shillings. If, however, they were married and they had children, then the price would be adjusted to include another 1.5 loaves. So if a man had a wife and a child, his wages would be made up to 6 shillings. So that's per person. Now, we often think of the workhouse as the actual institution that the 1834 Amendment Act had created, but they started being around, usually known as the poorhouses, from the Elizabethan Poor Law. And it had always been thought of as a way to deter people from using it, trying to encourage people to work extra hard at finding their job. But it becomes very expensive to run. Remember, these parishes are quite small, so the ability to run them for a small area is going to make it not cost effective at all. So it's in 1782 that you've got an MP who will push for this reform. And so from 1782, only orphan children and disabled and elderly and sick will actually be allowed to use this to get some help. All other able-bodied poor people, paupers, should remain outside and be made to look after themselves, encouraged to find work or receive a basic provision that would be determined by each of the parishes. The most common two we just looked at. So although we just went over some of the great benefits of the parishes getting to do their own way of giving relief, the fact that they know their people better, the most common systems do have some issues. With the roundsman system, you have some workers, some bosses, employers, who will keep the wages low because they can just always depend on the paupers who are getting this form of relief. And they are allowed to pay very small wages. That's why they're able to do this. And so a lot of workers who are wanting job, maybe more hours on the farm, or people who are looking to get into that industry, the agricultural industry, farming industry, they're not going to be happy with the roundsman system because they feel like they're being undercut by the paupers who are getting this form of relief. At the same time, you do have many paupers who decide not to bother going to work as they still got paid the same amount of money. So they would agree to do this work and then just not show up. Now, whether or not this happened often, don't have the evidence for that, but there's a perception for many people that actually this is encouraging them to be lazy. It's not trying to promote them ready for work. Now, the criticism with the Speen-Hamlin system is that it's great that the amount of money they get is tied to bread to ensure that they can actually eat. But when the price of bread rises, so does the cost of poor relief, which isn't great news for the parish. So they might be addressing the issue of revolution, making sure it doesn't happen, but then they've got some economic issues now, because it's going to cost more to run this. And again, whether or not this is actually true, we don't have the evidence. No historian out there in the textbooks offers anything like that. But there is a preconception by many people at the time that this form of relief encourages paupers to have larger families. So a bit similar to the idea today about child benefit encourages people to have a lot of kids. So add to the inefficiencies of both systems, or at least the conceived ones by people, whether real or not, there will also be some economic hard times, some depressions in the late 1700s onwards. mostly to do with the Revolutionary Wars in France, or Napoleonic Wars. So when you add all of those things into the mix, problems with trade, you're naturally going to have a lot more people out of work who are going to depend on some help from the poor law. When you add all of this together, the amount that it takes to run the poor relief grows. So in 1803, it was £4 million a year, and you've got 20 years later, it will go up to £7 million. Like, maybe not a huge increase, but it is almost double. And for the parishes, this is a lot to cope with. You've also got to remember that when the first census was taken in 1801, the population was about 9 million people, which is about double from the time of the original Poor Law Act in 1601. This is a lot more people that they thought that they'd be able to cope with. Parishes are now getting bigger. People who run it, the overseers, don't know everyone face to face anymore. They haven't grown up with everyone as they would have done back in 1601. At the same time, you've got more people traveling around. It's getting much tougher to be able to coordinate who pays for the relief of who. And you also have accusations of the overseers being incompetent because of corruption, that they actually weren't giving full attention to their job, as they wanted to be popular, so they wouldn't maybe be as forceful, as tough with the paupers as many of the public would have preferred. So we get to the Napoleonic Wars, which has already been referenced, which begins with the Revolution by most historians, and will end with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Now, during this time, Britain does prevail, but it was not an inexpensive task. It was over 20 years of warfare with only one short period of peace in 1804. All of this is bared by putting taxes on people, putting taxes on goods. As a result, you do have a lot higher unemployment in the country, and naturally you're going to have a lot more people needing to use poor relief, and as a result, the poor rates tended to increase in the parishes. This was, of course, up to the parish, but a lot of parishes did have to increase it. As you can imagine, the taxpayers who are paying the poor rate will increasingly complain as the poor rates have to increase during the Napoleonic Wars. And added to that, you will have more and more middle-class readers consuming books by intellectuals who come out against the poor, or they're coming out in reform of how we treat the poor. So either way, the current system will have to be changed. Now, one of them is Malthus, who believes in the idea that we'll reach a point at which we cannot cope with the amount of population we've got, that we'll end up not having the amount of food we need, and as a result there will be a starvation that will lead to a culling of the people, which he actually thinks is a good thing. It will mean that we rebalance the population. But he doesn't like the way that the relief is handled, and the fact that he believes encourages poverty to continue, because he says that the poor people are just having more children, and they have the security of having more children thanks to the poor relief. So for him, poor relief encourages growth of poor population. Townshend, just as negative, but his problem with the poor relief is that he thinks it's not encouraging the right attitudes. It's promoting laziness, and it's not giving the full extent of the lesson that poverty could provide. So we could just put poor relief encourages idleness. So on the other extreme, you've got Thomas Paine, well known for his books on the French Revolution, who wants the current poor law to be reformed, but not like Malthus or Townshend. He wants radical help. He wants government intervention, a lot more of it. He promotes the idea of giving pensions to over 50s, and child benefits by giving £4 per year for each child under 14 for 250,000 families. And you've got Robert Owen, who promotes the idea that people are, at their core, wanting to help themselves, that they don't want to take advantage of the system. And he believes that if you provide some encouragement and you give them some help, then they will use the tools to help themselves. So he believes in providing model communities where people could get the chance of self-improvement. Though Paine's ideas would be the norm 100 years later, with pensions being introduced under the Liberals, at this time it goes against the majority of the politicians' views. They believe in laissez-faire, the idea that the government shouldn't get too involved, should let things handle themselves, let the market decide these kind of issues. A third thinker is Jeremy Bentham, who has the idea of utilitarianism. It's the belief that humans are motivated by only two things: pleasure and pain. Now, although he did say that there should be proper investigation into poverty and the needs of the poor and how to address their issues, because of his idea of utilitarianism, most people thought that would, if it's true that people are motivated by pleasure and pain, then the best way of eliminating poverty is by making them suffer. Give them as little help as possible to make them suffer during their poverty. That's going to be the biggest motivation for them to get out of it and help themselves, force them to go the extra bit to get that job. Whether or not that is something that they can do is another matter, but that is what a lot of people who read these ideas will come to think as well. One more factor that puts pressure on changing the poor law system was the Corn Laws. This came from the Revolutionary Wars, the Napoleonic Wars. So during those wars, you had Napoleon trying to put pressure on Britain to come to the negotiating table by using a thing called a continental system. What this was basically trying to stop all trade to Britain from Europe, to put that pressure to make Britain surrender. It didn't work, but it did lead to the aristocracy, the landowners, getting used to selling all their food, specifically their grains and their corn, at very high prices. Now, most people would have thought it would make sense at the end of the war, once trade begins, open up the market again, let all the French goods, the Dutch goods, Spanish goods come in. But the aristocracy has now gotten used to getting pretty healthy profits. They're very worried about a flood of food coming into the market, which is going to lower the prices massively and hurt their profits, and possibly even push them out of the farming business. It's very similar, actually, to the current problem with oil, having suddenly a lot more oil coming into the market than we need, causing the prices to go down. Very similar situation. So what happened at the end of the war in 1815? You will have Parliament passing a law known as the Corn Law, that states that no foreign corn could be imported until domestic corn cost 80 shillings per quarter, which is 28 pounds in weight. Now, this high price causes the cost of food to increase, and subsequently depressed the domestic market for other goods, because people spent most of their earnings on food rather than on other goods, which is just going to have a knock-on effect on other industries. And this high ceiling of 80 shillings per quarter is never actually reached. So the prices of foods just continually stay up. So this has an effect on the Speen-Hamlin system, which ties the amount of poor relief to the price of bread, which makes it more expensive for the relief to be given. But also, it means that you're going to have more and more people being unemployed. Now, while economic prosperity will come back by the 1820s, the growth of towns, which is the focus of the essay question, is having a large impact on the high cost of the poor relief on different fronts. One is an idea from an economist whose name is David Ricardo, who will also add to the other ideas from other intellectuals. But his is about the fact that those paying the poor rate, which are the property owners, will also be commonly ones who will be employing people. And if you are making them pay through form of tax, the poor rate, to help subsidize welfare, the poor relief, then that means they're less likely to increase the wages for the poor. So it's a bit of a catch-22. So he believes that if you get rid of the poor rate, or lower it, then employers who are the taxpayers of the poor rate will increase wages of their workers. While the prosperity of the 1820s does lead the expenditure on poor relief to go down from cost per head of 11 shillings 7 pennies to after 1824 it is lowered to 9 shillings and 2 pennies, there are an increasing amount of low-paid workers who either need some support on top of what they're doing, or are easily losing their jobs whenever there is a little bump in the economy. Now, the growth of towns means that you will have a much larger concentration of low-paid workers, as the towns are where the factories are, that whenever there will be an economic bump, you will have a much, much larger proportion of the people and much larger numbers needing to use that poor relief. So, towns much larger concentration of low-paid workers likely to need poor relief. And this is money that's putting enormous strain on these parishes, which don't have much money, as it's only the property owners who are paying the poor rate, and as there aren't any as much of an increase in the amount of property owners, you don't have as much of an increase in the contributions through the poor rate than there are the increase in people needing the poor relief. So it's putting that strain. So overall, the growth of the towns creates a dense working population of people who are poorly paid, and they're not able to insulate themselves, protect themselves from economic downturns, as there will be. And these people are at the mercy of the market. So when that happens, you will have massive amounts of people going unemployed and turning towards a form of poor relief, putting that massive strain on the parishes, pushing people to want to find a national solution to this, finding a way to A, make it more efficient, but B, try to deter people from needing the relief, as more and more people believe that it was the poor people's themselves fault, that it was the paupers' fault for being poor. Although that's a slightly different factor that you wouldn't want to focus on for this question. Evidence of the kind of pressure that the economic downturn could cause is shown during the swing riots of 1830. So, sparked by unemployment, very angry people who will smash many machines that they view as one of the factors that led to their being fired and their lack of employment. This will push people to want to seek some reform to address the issues of the poor. All this will inevitably lead to, if I can move, there we go, to the Royal Commission of 1832. Now their task was to investigate the existing poor law system and to establish whether they had grounds for changing it. Now, although it has many mistakes, and we could criticize the way they did it, their findings, however ineffective their findings will shed light for many people and will convince the politicians to make those changes. So you had 9 commissioners, including economist Nassau and Edwin Chadwick. Now, many people think that they had already made up their minds and they had already started writing their recommendations before the investigation even happened. Nevertheless, they do send questionnaires to the 15,000 parishes. Still learning my ways with the stylus. And although only 10% of the questionnaires are actually returned, and the questions themselves are very, very leading and very confusing for the parishes to answer, the overall findings will convince people, the politicians, of a few things. The removal of outdoor relief, use of harsh workhouses, to act as a deterrent for those seeking relief, the ability for parishes to work together and manage the workhouses more effectively, and creating a central board to implement and oversee the new system. So, with that, you now have all the information for the different factors for answering the question of how far do you agree that the growth of industrial towns was the most significant factor in the breakdown of the old poor law system in the years 1815 to 34. So you do have to go into what the old system was. So you will have to describe the Speen-Hamlin system or the Roundsman system, and you go into how attitudes began to change, even though people like Jeremy Bentham's ideas, Thomas Paine's, they're before 1815, their ideas will continue, they do survive, and it's really between 1815 and 34 that some of those ideas will spread much larger and have a more influential impact on the people. Other factors to consider is the actual growth of the towns, which is in question. So the much larger proportion of people who are on low wages, more likely to go unemployed, it's putting massive strain on that parish. You've got a lot more people traveling by this time, people seeking work in the towns. Again, that's thanks to the growth of industrial towns, which is the question. But you will have the other factor of people who are determined to change it, such as the economist Nassau, Chadwick, and the evidences in the 1832 Royal Commission. You could have the other factor of swing riots. The fear of revolution will spur people to seek a change in the current poor law system. Okay, so good luck with the question.